So it's been sort of a remarkable day. It's been a remarkable weekend in the news, but today, everything that was already remarkable just got worse and darker and more complex, also more revelatory. It's just been an incredible news cycle that hopefully we're coming to an end of, and we're about to start something new. I think if you take the broad view, if you want to know where this current news cycle starts, it was actually just over 2 years ago, just under 2 years ago. When white supremacists and neo-Nazis and other charming members of the American far right descended on Charlottesville, Virginia. Crowds of young white men bearing torches, shouting things like, "Jews will not replace us." At a rally the day after the torch-lit chanting about Jews march in Charlottesville, a rally by the neo-Nazis, which was dwarfed by the throngs of counter-protesters, members of militant white supremacist groups attacked the counter-protesters violently. Several of them were later charged with traveling to Charlottesville with the intention of inciting a riot. It was at that rally, the day after the torch-lit march, that a neo-Nazi drove his car deliberately into a crowd of counter-protesters, a moment captured by a local photojournalist in this harrowing photograph, which just instantly became the defining image of that terrible moment in American history. When that neo-Nazi plowed his car into that crowd, he injured dozens of people. He killed one young counter-protester, a young woman named Heather Heyer. Immediately thereafter, President Trump came out and said that there were very fine people on both sides that day in Charlottesville. He expressed sympathy with the far-right marchers' support for the Confederacy and Confederate symbols. He said the press had treated them very unfairly. Well, today, the neo-Nazi guy who deliberately drove his car into those counter-protesters and injured dozens of people and killed Heather Heyer, today he was sentenced to life in prison plus 419 years. That was his sentence today, handed down on state charges. On federal charges, he already got an additional life sentence. But that moment when Donald Trump refused to condemn the violent white supremacists in Charlottesville who had just killed someone, I mean, talk about a defining image, right, or a defining moment. Those remarks from Trump after Charlottesville just rang like a struck tuning fork. Just a moment of pure tonal clarity about our new president and about our country now with him as our political leader. I mean, it was only 2 summers before that where there was President Barack Obama singing Amazing Grace at the memorial for 9 mostly elderly African-American churchgoers who were killed by a young white supremacist. It's just 2 years later, he's succeeded in office by a new president who responds to the murder in Charlottesville by a neo-Nazi by praising the very fine people on the neo-Nazi side, lamenting how they got a raw deal in the press. When Barack Obama's Vice President Joe Biden declared his run for the presidency this year, his announcement video centered on the moral collapse represented by Trump's response to Charlottesville, calling it a threat to the nation, quote, unlike any I had seen in my lifetime. Well, today, as the life plus 419-year sentence for that murder in Charlottesville was handed down, President Trump today is thwacking that same tuning fork again as hard as he can, attacking minority members of Congress as vicious, disgusting, al-Qaeda-loving America haters. This after hitting them with the old "go back to your own country" slur this weekend. Last time around, after Charlottesville, some Republicans at least expressed some disgust at what the president had said. This time, not so much, at least not as much. A handful of backbench Republicans have worked up the gumption to say something, but most have made clear that whatever else you might say about the president's comments, they are definitely not racist. No siree, no racism here. And the president, of course, is enjoying this, as always. I mean, the outrage in the press and among Democrats, he's milking it for all it's worth. It's not like this wasn't on purpose. Congresswoman Ilhan Omar of Minnesota is going to be joining us live here tonight in just a moment as she continues to be one of these minority female congresswomen who is specifically being targeted by the president and now following his lead. She's also being targeted by his campaign, by his supporters. There's no easy antidote to a political leader who stakes his future on maximizing racial hatred and racial resentment and trying to stoke as much anger and division as possible because he thinks it redounds to his political benefit. There's no magic spell to unwind that tactic or to stop its harm. But one thing that strategy does not easily countenance or control is the prospect of the targets of that racist invective speaking for themselves, speaking on their own terms about the things that they care about and who they really are and what they believe about our country. I mean, demagogic racial vilification depends on distance, right? At least perceived distance. It depends on us really not knowing each other. It depends on us being willing to fear and blame each other because we don't know any better. Congresswoman Omar is more than able to speak for herself on her own terms. And she will be joining us live in just a moment. She's actually, I think this is going to be her first television interview since the president started this whole go back to your country attack on her. An attack it appears he's going to try to juice for as long as possible because he likes how it's playing, and apparently this is foundational to the way he's running for re-election. I should mention we've also got a guest here tonight who's going to help us understand what the administration just did today to try to stop people from applying for asylum in America. I think everybody now realizes that it is no coincidence that the president is starting up these attacks on non-white members of Congress. At the same time, he is repeatedly announcing gigantic roundups of immigrants and their families, and the same time that he's upscaling the horrendous detention conditions on the border. Even now, showing off the pens in which he's holding immigrant men who've been held for weeks and not allowed to clean themselves. He thinks that's a good look for him. The outrage over how the Trump administration is treating immigrants, even the outrage over the foul treatment and the needless deaths of little kids in federal detention. To this president, it hits the same sweet note, right? Hits the same sweet note as the outrage over him singling out and attacking the minority congresswoman. Hits the same note as him praising the neo-Nazi fine people at Charlottesville. Oh, you're mad about that? That makes you mad? How mad does that make you? What they just announced today in terms of changes to asylum law, though, I mean, it's of a piece with all these other things going on, but I think it's also worth seeing it as maybe this president's most radical effort to change laws along racial lines since the Muslim ban that he tried to implement as soon as he got into office. So the asylum changes tonight, again, part of a larger mosaic in terms of how the president is running and how he's using race to try to get himself reelected. But we'll get some help understanding that proposed change tonight as well. That's all coming up. And I do feel like, though, there is another sort of aspect of the landscape here that is worth seeing at the same time. Because I don't think it's unrelated. I don't think there's a total disconnect between how the president is running for re-election, the kind of outrage he's stoking, and what else is going on that is stuff that's happening to him that he can't necessarily control. Because all of the stuff that he's doing in terms of racist vilification and the stoking the hatred and dehumanization of immigrants and basking and bathing in the outrage over it, it's all unfolding amid a whole bunch of other stuff, a whole bunch of other storylines that are not things that he can control and that I think he's banking on just being able to distract from. For example, today was the first day of what is only the second criminal trial to have resulted from the Mueller investigation and the Russia scandal. I know, it didn't make a lot of headlines, right? I mean, there have been dozens of criminal indictments derived from Mueller's probe. There have been dozens of indictments. There have been lots of guilty pleas. There's been no acquittals. But before today, there had only been one trial in front of a jury. The president's campaign chairman, Paul Manafort, convicted of 8 felonies at that trial. He's now serving a 7-year federal prison sentence while he simultaneously awaits the start of his trial on state charges as well. But so far, Paul Manafort, the president's campaign chair, is the only person in the Mueller investigation and the whole Russia investigation to actually go on trial. But the second criminal trial after Manafort started today in the Eastern District of Virginia, and it is a trial of this man. He's a Trump transition official named Bijan Kian. Kian appears to have been the #2 Trump transition official on intelligence matters, which means he was involved in the Trump transition on things like, little stuff, like picking new senior leadership at the CIA, little stuff. While he was doing that work, while he was the #2 official in the Trump transition on intelligence, Kian is now charged with having been an unregistered agent who was secretly on the payroll of a foreign country. Now, the drama of this trial starting, apart from the inherent drama of a criminal trial, right, and the fact that yet another person in the Trump transition is being accused of working secretly for a foreign government, even beyond all of that drama, there's also, in this new trial that started today, the ongoing drama and big unanswered questions now about Mike Flynn, Trump's national security advisor. Mike Flynn, he was one of the first people to be charged by Mueller, one of the first guilty pleas in the whole Russia scandal. Flynn pled guilty to lying to investigators about his secret communications with the Russian government during the transition. He became a cooperating witness at that time. Flynn was apparently a good cooperator for at least a while. The special counsel's office recommended to Flynn's sentencing judge that Mike Flynn should get 0 time in prison as recognition of how much help he was able to provide them as a cooperating witness. But still, even with that recommendation from the special counsel, something about Flynn's case clearly bugged the sentencing judge. And when Mike Flynn showed up in court in December, expecting to be sentenced, probably expecting to be sentenced to 0 time served because of that recommendation from prosecutors, things took a turn. The judge ended up reaming Mike Flynn out in the courtroom, essentially calling him a traitor, suggesting that Flynn might want to delay his sentencing until he'd had more time to be even more cooperative, to give the government even more help, given how serious the judge thought Flynn's crimes were. Well, Flynn didn't get sentenced that day. He still doesn't have a sentencing date. But since then, Mike Flynn dumped his legal team. He hired a new legal team that are anti-Robert Mueller crusaders, because that's a job now in the American right. His new lead lawyer is the author of a book about the Justice Department being full of liars. They're all corrupt, and they're out to get conservatives. And in particular, it's about how terrible and corrupt and criminal Robert Mueller and his prosecutors are. His lead lawyer has been basically a full-time anti-Robert Mueller, anti-Russia investigation pundit on Fox News and in the conservative media world for months now. That's who's leading Flynn's new legal team. And since Flynn got that new legal team, things have gone wobbly for him in court. Flynn had been expected to be the star witness in the Bijan-Kian case that started today. He was expected to testify about the two of them, business partners, secretly working on behalf of a foreign government while also working on the Trump campaign. Well, Flynn now will not be called as a witness. Prosecutors now say they'd consider him to be a co-conspirator with Kian. They now tell the judge they're going to wait, Flynn's sentencing judge, that they're going to wait to see what happens at the Kian trial before they decide if they're going to change that recommendation that Mike Flynn shouldn't get jail time. And prosecutors are now saying they're going to call Mike Flynn's son, Mike Flynn Jr., as a witness in the Kian trial, even though they're not calling Mike Flynn Sr. anymore because they consider him to be a co-conspirator. So the Kian trial started today, only the second jury trial of the Mueller investigation. And nobody really knows where that is going to go. And the question of the resolution of the case against Trump's national security advisor, this key figure in his campaign, Mike Flynn, is now suddenly absolutely wide open, and we expect revelations in court. Jury selection was today. Opening arguments started today. This is going to be a drama over the next week. And now on top of that, tonight, CNN has just broken a remarkable news story that appears to fill in a key part of the plot that we had not previously had about what happened in the 2016 elections. And it has to do with
Wikileaks. 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 The Wikileaks.
This just came out. This just came out. Wikileaks. I love Wikileaks.
The Hillary Clinton documents released today by Wikileaks.
Exposed by WikiLeaks.
We don't talk about WikiLeaks. They got it all down, folks. WikiLeaks.
The president promoted WikiLeaks and their release of stolen Democratic and Clinton campaign documents more than 150 times on the campaign trail in the run-up to his election. Now, it became clear during the campaign that those materials that WikiLeaks was releasing is stuff that was hacked by Russia. But WikiLeaks always denied they had anything to do with Russia. According to WikiLeaks and Julian Assange, which are basically one and the same, according to him, he just plucked those stolen documents out of the ether somehow, and anybody who says they're from Russia is making stuff up. So there have been these clear assertions from the intelligence agencies and from Robert Mueller's report, and there have been these definitive denials from WikiLeaks that they had anything to do with Russia. But before tonight, we never really had any clear narrative detail about how Russia and WikiLeaks did it, how Russia funneled all this stuff to WikiLeaks to be released during the campaign to such important effect. Well, tonight, CNN has obtained surveillance logs that appear to show exactly how WikiLeaks got all that stolen material from Russian intelligence during the 2016 campaign. And it is a fascinating story. Julian Assange, founder of WikiLeaks, you may know, he is currently in jail in the UK. He's fighting extradition to the US to face other unrelated charges. But starting in 2012 and right through the 2016 campaign, Julian Assange was holed up inside Ecuador's embassy in London, where he was trying to evade other various criminal charges and extradition claims. According to CNN's reporting tonight, the government of Ecuador was happy enough, sort of, to keep hosting him in that embassy as the years dragged on while he was staying there. But they did hire 3 separate security firms to do intensive surveillance on their own embassy while he was there. And it is the logs from one of those security firms that they've just published tonight, which appear to show how Russia did it, how they transferred to WikiLeaks those reams of stolen material that Trump celebrated, right? That WikiLeaks released during the campaign to try to cause maximum damage to Hillary Clinton and maximum benefit to Donald Trump. That's the stuff that Donald Trump spent every single day promoting during his campaign. And we had known that the intelligence community had said that WikiLeaks was operating as a cutout for Russian intelligence. We had never had any narrative before about how exactly they did it. We just had WikiLeaks denials. But now, look at the timeline here. June 14th. That's when the Democratic Party announces it has been hacked. It's had its material stolen. DNC blames the Russian government for the crime. June 19th, which is 5 days later, Julian Assange asks the Ecuadorian embassy to please beef up his internet connection. He also asked the embassy for, quote, technical support, quote, for data transmission and for helping install some kind of new equipment. Over the course of that month, June 2016, Assange, according to CNN, has a big spike in the number of people coming to visit him at the embassy. Something like 75 people came to visit him that month alone. That month, he also has at least 7 in-person meetings at the at the embassy he's living at with Russian nationals. At least 7 meetings with different Russian nationals and people connected to the Kremlin. As well as that same month, he has lots of online contact with fake personas set up by Russia. Well, on July 6th, Julian Assange tells these online personas who claim to have all the hacked material that he wants them to send anything Hillary-related as soon as possible, quote, because the Democratic National Convention is approaching and she will solidify Bernie supporters behind her after. 8 days later, mid-July, July 14th, this is when the RNC is starting, but the Democratic National Convention hasn't yet started. On that day, July 14th, Julian Assange meets for more than 4 hours at the Ecuadorian embassy with 2 well-known high-end German hackers, one of whom is described in the Mueller report as someone who may have assisted with the transfer of the Russian stolen documents to WikiLeaks. So he meets for 4 hours with these high-end German hackers in person. That same day, the Russians send Assange encrypted files that are labeled Big Archive. 4 days after that, July 18th, quote, an embassy security guard broke protocol by abandoning his post to receive a package outside the embassy from a man in disguise. The man covered his face with a mask and sunglasses. According to CNN tonight, quote, the security company saw this unfold on surveillance footage and recommended that the guard be replaced. But the Ecuadorian government kept him on the job. That same day, July 18th, 2016, WikiLeaks gets back in touch with the Russians and tells them, thanks, we got the files. Thank you very much. 4 days after that, July 22nd, WikiLeaks releases more than 20,000 internal files from the Democratic Party, which of course were timed and designed to cause maximum disruption to Clinton's nomination and maximum division between Clinton supporters and people who supported Bernie Sanders after the primary. They basically upended the whole Democratic National Convention with that first release in July. Skip ahead to September 15th, the Russians reach back out to Julian Assange and WikiLeaks to tell them, hey, we got more stuff. We got more material that might hurt Clinton. They tell Julian Assange, quote, you won't be disappointed, I promise. 4 days after that, the same high-end German hacker named in the Mueller report comes back to the embassy to once again meet with Julian Assange in person that day. The security firm says that they observed Julian Assange that day installing new computer cables in his room. That date, September 19th, is singled out in the Mueller report as the day the Russians sent Assange the emails that they had hacked from Clinton's campaign chairman, John Podesta. Within a couple of weeks, October 7th, Julian Assange / Wikileaks start releasing the John Podesta emails. They start releasing them on the day of the Access Hollywood tape, which of course threatened to end the Trump campaign altogether. That's also the day the U.S. government publicly blamed Russia for the hack of the DNC and their messing with the election. Now, within a week of that, the U.S. government apparently told Ecuador, hey, whatever's going on with Julian Assange in your embassy, it's time to stop. In response, this is October 2016, right before the election. In response, Ecuador cuts off Assange's internet access at the embassy. Days later, October 18th, Julian Assange and WikiLeaks clear everything out. Quote, by 1 a.m., 2 WikiLeaks personnel arrived at the embassy and started removing computer equipment, as well as a large box containing about 100 hard drives. And we know this because CNN got their surveillance footage logs from one of the 3 security firms Ecuador hired to surveil its own embassy while Julian Assange was living there, apparently running this pro-Russia propaganda campaign to try to elect Trump and to try to submarine Hillary Clinton's chances. It's just remarkable stuff. It's not clear if Robert Mueller and his team had access to this exact surveillance footage and these security logs from Julian Assange's time at the embassy, the stuff that CNN is reporting on tonight. In the WikiLeaks section of Mueller's report, there's a fair number of redactions. As you can see here, a lot of these redactions are described as being there because they would otherwise give away investigative methods. But, you know, on a day when the president is posting up his re-election campaign to run on the fuel of maximum racial division, right? I mean, it is just a remarkable thing to take the wide lens, right? To have these be the other ambient things you need to know right now about his presidency on this day, right? On this day, yet another criminal trial starting for someone on his transition campaign who was allegedly a secret foreign agent working with his national security advisor at the time, who has already pled guilty to lying to the FBI about his secret communications with the Russians. And on the same day, this new open source reporting puts in the missing pieces of not just that Russia tried to help elect Trump, and not just why Russia tried to elect Trump, but the actual nuts and bolts of how they did it. You know, from the clandestine meetings, to the data transfers, to the disguises and the surveillance footage. I mean, in general, in life, I think it's a good idea to try to keep things in perspective as much as you can, right? But how do you keep this all in perspective, right? I mean, how high up do you need to get in elevation before you can look down at this circumstance, at this news cycle alone, and say, yeah, this is fine. We can handle this. It's just a remarkable day in the news, just a remarkable pivot point in this presidency today. Congresswoman Ilhan Omar from Minnesota is here next. Stay with us.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.